Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining this webinar on how we can work with governments to improve routing security. I'm here with several amazing panelists from all around the world, actually, from 3 different continents, to talk about how governments are working on routing security and improving routing security. My name is Ryan Polk. I work for the Internet Society as a director of internet policy, and have been working on routing security for, I guess, the last 5 years. And a lot of that has been working with governments on trying to improve routing security and in trying to make sure that folks understand really what routing security is all about. So today I am joined by several amazing panelists. First, we'll start with Brian Scott, who is the Deputy Assistant National Cybersecurity Cyber Director for Cyber Policy and Programs at the Office of the National Cyber Director in the United States. He's responsible for coordinating policy and efforts related to the cybersecurity of private sector and public sector non-federal critical infrastructure. So if your power goes out, he can tell you whether to be mad at your power company or potentially if the US government should be very mad at someone else. We also have Veronica Tan, who's leading the safer cyberspace efforts in the Cybersecurity Agency of Singapore. This includes developing technology programs to help organizations raise their level of cyber resilience. And prior to joining the public sector, Veronica was in a network engineering role at an internet service provider in Singapore. We also have Marco Hogewoning, who is the senior policy advisor at the Dutch Ministry of Economic Affairs and Climate Policy. Prior to joining the Dutch government, Marco spent 11 years at RIPE NCC, where he held various roles in their external relations and public policy and internet governance teams. He also has a technical background and worked as a network engineer at network operators earlier in his career. We also have Gerben Klein Baltink, who is the chairman of the Dutch Internet Standards Platform and the Secure Email Coalition. He also works as the information manager for 5 municipalities in the province of Utrecht in the Netherlands, and as the managing advisor and co-owner of MKB Cyber Advice Netherlands. He also was the secretary of Dutch National Cybersecurity Council from 2011 to 2014. And among the many, many hats he wears, he also is the CEO of an electric bike company. So if you have any interest in electric bikes, he's also someone to go to. Last but not least, we have Doug Montgomery. He's the manager of Internet Technologies Research at the National Institute of Standards and Technology, or NIST. He's led Internet Technologies research at NIST since 1986, and he provides technical leadership to NIST's current research and standardization efforts in trustworthy networks, including things like infrastructure protection, next generation internet technologies, 5G, core infrastructure, and many, many other things. So thank you all again for all of you joining this panel. And we'll start off with a poll for people in the audience to see just where everyone's from. We have folks from different parts of industry or the public sector. And then we'll jump into the session. Give it a few more seconds. All right, so we have several people from government and from the education sector, along with ISPs and IT services. Awesome. So we'll start off with a fireside chat with Brian talking about the new implementation plan for the US government's national cybersecurity strategy. This is something that's come out just last week, I believe. And it's very exciting from my perspective, as it's it's a really a big sign in terms of how the US government has gotten more and more focused on cybersecurity issues more generally, but also on routing security. And so I'll turn it over to Brian now to start talking a little bit more about the National Cybersecurity Strategy, how we got here, and really narrowing down on the routing security aspects of it. So Brian.
Yeah, sure. Thanks. And Ryan, thank you. And it's a pleasure to be here with all of you. And thank you for the opportunity to speak a little bit about the United States National Cybersecurity Strategy and the implementation plan and internet routing security. So just as kind of a little bit of background, the office that I'm part of, the Office of the National Cyber Director, was established 2 years ago. We are the newest element of the White House Executive Office of the President, and we're solely focused on the cybersecurity issues for the United States and all of our critical infrastructure and working with our partners. So to Ryan's point, the United States National Cybersecurity Strategy was issued in March of this past year, and the implementation plan was just released last week on July 13th. Both the strategy and the implementation plan are available on the White House website under the Office of the National Cyber Director. I want to note one of the things that the strategy itself says. President Biden notes in the introduction, we must ensure the internet remains open, free, global, interoperable, reliable, and secure, anchored in universal values that respect human rights and fundamental freedoms. Digital connectivity should be a tool that uplifts and empowers people everywhere, not one used for repression and coercion. As this strategy details, the United States is prepared to meet this challenge from a position of strength, leading in lockstep with our closest allies and working with partners everywhere who share our vision for a brighter digital future. So that is the key piece right there out of the strategy from the president, from President Biden. So the strategy itself, builds on existing efforts, but also previous efforts. There's a lot of good work that's been done over the past several years to include what we have as Executive Order 14028, which again applied mainly to the U.S., but I think is informative to really everyone with a lot of good actions in it. But the National Cybersecurity Strategy itself really looks for, and it calls for, two fundamental shifts in how the United States allocates roles, responsibilities, and resources in cyberspace. The first of those is to rebalance the responsibility for defending cyberspace. Today's digital ecosystem too often devolves risk down to the lowest common denominator, to those who are least capable of defending themselves against, pernicious cyber actors, malicious cyber actors, and nation states. It's not efficient, it's not effective, it's not right, and we really need the biggest, most capable, and best positioned actors to take a bigger responsibility in mitigating that risk. So that's the first. The second one is we really need to look at how we have our alignment of our incentive structures. Our incentive structures right now, we are continuing to focus on response activities. We'll always need to do response activities, but we really need to invest in the future to make a more secure digital ecosystem. So those are the two big shifts that are within the strategy. The strategy really advances this through 5 pillars. And I'm just going to read through these or go through them pretty quickly because I want to get to the key one that is, I think, the most important to this group. So the 5 pillars in our strategy are: first, defend critical infrastructure. Pretty clear. We need to make sure that we maintain our critical infrastructure and essential services that they provide. The second is to disrupt and dismantle threat actors, using all the instruments of power, working with our partners internationally to go ahead and to dismantle and take down threat cyber actors. The third is to shape market forces to drive resilience and security, taking the consequences away from those with poor cybersecurity from the most vulnerable and making our digital ecosystem more secure. And fourth, and this is the one that I want to come back to, is invest in a resilient future. Strategic investments, coordinated, collaborative action that's what we're going to focus on. And I'll come back to that in just a second. And then the fifth is to forge international partnerships to pursue shared goals. So those are the key pieces, the key elements of the strategy. In the strategy, underneath those 5 pillars, there's actually 27 strategic objectives. And of specific interest to this group are the issues in Pillar 4, invest in a resilient future, where a key strategic objective is secure the technical foundation of the internet. So that is the key one. That's the one I want to focus on if I can. So that strategic objective in the strategy says, again, preserving and extending the open, free, global, interoperable, reliable, and secure internet requires sustained engagement for standards development, processes to instill our values and ensure technical standards produce technologies that are secure and resilient. We must take steps to mitigate the most urgent of these pervasive concerns, such as BGP vulnerabilities, unencrypted DNS requests, and the slow adoption of IPv6. So those are some of the key pieces. We must take steps to mitigate the most urgent of the pervasive concerns, identification of the most pressing of these security challenges, further development of effective security measures, and close collaboration between the public and the private sector. So those are the key pieces. The federal government is going to partner with stakeholders to develop and drive adoption of solutions that will improve the security of the internet ecosystem and support research to understand and address concerns for slow adoption. So this is where we're going. As part of the strategy, for any strategy to be effective, it's got to have an implementation plan. So again, as I mentioned, last week, the implementation plan was issued. We are now the president has directed us to issue an implementation plan and to report annually. So we started work on that. The implementation plan actually contains 69 initiatives. I would note that beyond the 69 initiatives, there are other activities that are going on that support the strategy, but there's 69 specific initiatives that are available publicly for you to look at, again, on the White House website. The implementation plan includes at least 2 specific initiatives that really build upon previous and current efforts and activities that are of specific interest to this group. The first initiative is to accelerate the development and standardization and support the adoption of foundational internet infrastructure capabilities and technologies. NIST, the National Institute for Standards and Technology, is going to lead this effort and collaborate with the interagency, industry, academia, and other communities to address BGP and IPv6 security gaps by driving development, commercialization, and adoption of international standards. That's their action item in the implementation plan. The second is to collaborate with key stakeholders to drive security, to drive secure internet routing. That one, my office has responsibility for, and it's beyond just the standards piece and the work that NIST is going to do. But what we want to do is to, our office, in conjunction with appropriate U.S. federal government stakeholders and other key stakeholders, will develop a roadmap to increase the adoption of secure internet routing technology by, again, identifying what the security challenges are, exploring approaches and options to address internet routing and BGP security concerns, identifying and informing best practices, identifying needed research and development, and also identifying barriers to adoption and mitigation approaches. So our intent is we will be convening a group of select subject matter experts and stakeholders to examine these issues and consider approaches for the path forward. So let me stop there. That's kind of I know I took a little bit of time there, but I think it was important to really address, here's what's in the strategy, and here's the actions that we're going to take moving forward. So I want to just emphasize that the United States is committed to going ahead and addressing these concerns and really moving the ball forward. Thank you.
Thanks, Brian. That's fantastic to hear and fantastic news. And I'm especially excited, well, from the Internet Society perspective, I'm very excited when I read the start of the National Security Plan with the focus on open internet and globally connected internet, as this is one of those spaces where some governments might take a route that is not very good for the open internet when trying to fix routing security. So it's really fantastic to see that. So I actually wanted to jump back into one of the things you said and go back a little bit to the why you all are doing this. So I really wanted to get to know some of the challenges that you all are seeing a little bit in the cybersecurity space more generally, but also in routing security in the United States, and kind of the reasoning why this administration thought there's a need for a new national security strategy, and especially around things like routing security.
So a couple of things. I think, the why is probably apparent to a lot of people, on this call. But, the one thing that I would say is we recognize the importance of the digital ecosystem and the interconnectedness of not only within the United States, but with, across the globe. We value we see the internet, and we see the connectedness, interconnectedness of our society as something that needs to be protected and needs to be, given value and nurtured for all, the benefit of all. So that's kind of the key piece. And certainly we see the interconnectedness of, especially when we start talking about critical infrastructure, and we look at, our banking systems, every critical infrastructure sector we have, whether it's agriculture, electricity, these are all interconnected in ways that have made our lives more efficient, but have also expanded that, perhaps that attack vector landscape, so that we, again, we really need to focus on defending that and making sure that we have a good open system for everyone. So some of the challenges, I won't go into too many of the challenges. I'll give you what I think is the summary. I think the folks on this call are probably better positioned to talk about some of the challenges, but I think they really fall into several approaches, right? Technical challenges. I think there's incentive challenges. There's legal and contractual challenges. There's, the adoption of standards, and there's also, I think, probably most importantly, the coordination aspect. So, one of the things that I think we've seen as, in the research that I've done and in talking with all the folks I've talked to, is the fact that there's a lot of ideas that are out there, but, getting a coordinated approach to moving it forward is one of those key challenges. But the technical barriers, again, some of the capabilities and technologies are at various stages of maturity. And of course, the technology is always changing and updating. So where do you, being agile enough to address the evolving threat and to evolve, to address evolving technology is, of course, I think one of those big challenges. The incentive piece, we really need to make sure that, again, how much is the benefit for a single agency or a single organization to adopt BGP security technologies on their own? How do we make that, how do we give the strength of those technologies across the broader ecosystem, the broader partners and stakeholders? So I think that's one. Looking at some of the legal and contractual barriers to, RPKI adoption, how do we move that forward? How do we look at those things? And then standards, NIST is doing a lot of work in the development of commercialization, adoption of international standards. That is one of their tasks. So I think that's the key piece, is getting, consensus from an international perspective and even within the US on the standards. And then, as I mentioned, I think that coordinated effort. We need coordinated effort to really drive the progress. My office has got the responsibility for developing a path forward for the US federal interagency to include NIST, NTIA, DHS, the Cybersecurity Infrastructure Security Agency, the Federal Communications Commission. We've got a lot of players that we need to bring together, and that's not even talking about all the international players that have equities and that we need to work with. So again, I think those are some of the challenges, and I look forward. I'm going to try to listen in and hear what some of the folks have to say about some of this as we move into the next panel on their thoughts. So I think these are going to be very important.
Thanks for that. And I really want to focus a little bit on what you said about agility and the ability to try to tackle this issue when you have so many different players and so many disparate places around or parts of the world that are working on these issues. One of the beauties of the decentralized routing system is that agility and that ability to shift and change things to try to improve routing security in incremental ways. And going down the overly prescriptive prescriptive route when it comes to routing security can really limit that sometimes. And so I'm really glad to hear that from you all about agility and trying to keep that agility there, so that when we have new technologies, things like ROV, which is newer, whatever the ROV is of the future route origin validation of the future is, being able to shift to that easily. That's really great to hear. So I think, looking at the time, are there any final notes that you have, ways that people on this call should be getting involved, or be looking out to be getting involved before we move on to our next panel?
So I would just say that, we intend to be informed by, previous work that's been going on and current work that's going on. Forums such as this are informative and help inform it. So I know Doug Montgomery is on, from NIST, contributions and comments here will help inform our path going forward. We intend to engage with, with a whole range of people. I would note that, there's ongoing efforts between NIST developing security guidelines and practice guides related to BGP security and resilience technologies. There are comment periods for those which folks can contribute to. Those are going to be leveraged. We intend to leverage and be informed by those activities. I would also note that the U.S. Federal Communications Commission is going to host a public workshop on BGP security on Monday, the 31st of July. Again, the event is intended to build a robust record generated by the Commission's note of inquiry from a year and a half ago. But again, those are areas where I think, folks can participate and contribute and can help inform our path forward as we work on a coordinated effort moving forward.
Thank you for that. And I know folks from the Internet Society will definitely be there during that workshop. So I encourage others in the audience to join as well in that workshop. Thanks so much, Brian, for all your contributions here on the National Cybersecurity Strategy and explain the National Cybersecurity Strategy, and also on helping rate the cybersecurity strategy. Like I said before, it's really great to see this from the U.S. federal government, and I'm really excited for the path forward with you all on routing security. So thank you.
My pleasure, and thanks for the opportunity to join you.
So next up, we are going to internationalize this. I say internationalize this because I'm based in the United States, but we have our panel with Veronica, Gerben, Marco, and Doug, where we'll talk about different perspectives on routing security issues around the world, coming from different governments. So we have Veronica from Singapore, Gerben and Marco from the Netherlands, and Doug from the US as well, like Brian. So before we jump into this panel, I wanted to give some quick statistics, kind of snapshots of where networks in the Netherlands, Singapore, and the United States are on routing security. This is information that we get from our Manners Observatory, which for Manners members and non-Manners members alike, I highly recommend you take a look at it. It's a lot of fun to look at different countries and see how different countries are doing in routing security and how it's changed over time. It's very interesting data. Also, I'm just a data nerd and I love maps, so that's part of it. So anyhow, how are we doing on routing security? And I'll really just focus on one measure, which is on RPKI deployment, which right now, the global average deployment of RPKI is that 44.7% of all prefixes can be validated using RPKI. And this is really important because RPKI allows network operators to basically double check to make sure that the routes that they're seeing are actually what they expect them to be, and going to the being advertised by the right people. We're expected to break about 50% globally this year. So deployment on hopefully more than half of our prefixes can be validated using RPKI. But how are we doing right now in the Netherlands, Singapore, and the United States? So if you look at the Netherlands has already broken 50% deployment of RPKI. 53.5% of prefixes could be RPKI validated in the Netherlands in June of 2023. Similarly, Singapore is also doing really well on deployment. 60.2% of prefixes could be RPKI validated. The US, while a little bit lower in terms of deployment of RPKI, is rapidly catching up. So in June of 2023, only 29.3% of prefixes in the United States could be RPKI validated. That being said, in the United States, that RPKI adoption has grown significantly among the private sector and non-governmental networks. It's actually grown in those last 3 years by 250%, which is a lot faster than the global average. So the United States still lower in RPKI, but catching up, which is what I like to say. So given where we are on routing security around the world, and kind of at this moment where we're almost to halfway to RPKI deployment, but not quite there yet globally, I was wondering and wanted to hear from you all about what specific challenges you all are seeing when it comes to routing security in your countries and in your regions. And I think we'll go ahead and start with you, Veronica, to hear about how routing security is going in Singapore and the challenges that you're seeing.
Well, okay, hi. So we often say that cybersecurity is a collective responsibility and team sport. And I would say that routing security is no different. The way BGP works, autonomous systems are interconnected. And basically, we need collective action across the ecosystem in order to make a change. So the problem with so-called security is that it always usually comes with the cost, and there will always be an additional cost to actually implement secure routing. The question is, who is responsible for bearing the cost? Earlier on, Brian talked a little bit about coordination across multiple stakeholders, and very importantly, the incentive structures. So I think technology challenges can be addressed over time, but more importantly is to make sure that the incentive structures are there or in place so that operators and basically different stakeholders in the ecosystem have the motivations to implement secure routing. So one may argue that as end users using the internet, we do benefit from a secure routing system, and this cost should then be accrued to the end users by asking them to pay more for internet access. But it's really hard to do this because this is generally a competitive market, and we will have to factor in things like consumer choice, consumer preference, and so on. The other so-called benefit of a secure routing system could be to applications as well, and then should they bear the cost. However, in terms of a secure routing system, it doesn't really absolve them from application integrity issues. So many of them would also focus on their end solutions or their own solutions within application to basically overcome the secure routing issues. So I think end of the day, I would say probably not specific or unique to Singapore, but applicable equally globally. One of the key challenges I would say is finding the right incentive structures to bring all the to incentivize all the players to come on board and to be able to take collective action and to do so in a coordinated manner. Because if one part of the network is implementing secure routing, but the other parts are not, holistically, I think we're not actually getting the end effect and end outcome, which means that the early players also do not necessarily feel very motivated to get started in this journey. So I think that from my perspective would be one of the largest challenges in working towards a global secure routing system in the world.
Thanks for that. And that's a really good point about customers, because at least on the residential side, I don't think about how good my routing security is for my network operator. I really should, given what I know. But that wasn't the first thing I thought about. The first thing I thought about was speed and price. And so that is something that we need to figure out how to address. And I think there's some things that are being worked on with manners to try and address that, especially with larger companies as customers. But on the residential side, for instance, that's just not going to be a thing. Next up, how about we go to you, Gerben, and then Marco for the perspective from the Netherlands.
Well, thank you, Ryan. I think the perspective in the Netherlands is quite similar to what Veronica told us. We see that there is not a direct interest with end users to have something like routing security. It's not a topic that is on their mind, as you mentioned yourself. Price and speed, availability, those are the things they focus on. So if you never had a route leak or route hijack, you probably are not going to ask for route security as an end user. The focus we therefore have already since the beginning of the Dutch Internet Standards platform is on the whole system, the internet infrastructure, and not only with routing security, but with all the open modern standards that we see relevant to the functioning of the internet, to keep it open, free and secure. We think that the approach should be to have a holistic view on what is necessary to keep the internet working in a trusted way. And you cannot only focus on end users. Many times they do not understand the relevance of a standard or security issues. And you can neither rely on the operators, because there always cost will be an issue. If the customer is not willing to pay for it, they are not going to offer it. So I think the big challenge is to convince the users of the internet, but especially the operators, that secure routing actually is an issue that we should pay attention to. What we do, and I will explain that later on, is focus on easy accessible testing to see how your internet provider, for example, your email provider is adhering to open standards. And we think that that has helped us in the Netherlands, at least, to make some improvements in the percentage of RPKI signed domains. Yeah. So basically.
Thank you for that, Marco.
Yes. Yeah, and I think you raise an important point. Is in the end user doesn't care or doesn't know, and that's always as a policymaker, that is usually where you step in. That's where you start to look at making policy to protect those public interests and help. At the same time, Brian already raised it. It's difficult, and as Veronica said, there are costs involved. So, in terms of what can you do from a policy perspective, the Dutch government and I also have to recognize the pioneering work that NIST has done in the past. We also try to put that incentive in the market by using our purchasing power. So in the Netherlands, there is a extensive list of standards that we as the government enforce upon ourselves when purchasing IT and ICT products. RPKI is on that list together with IPv6 and a number of other things. And we hope by doing it that way that we also kind of provide the carrot for the market, and especially in the supply chain, to incentivize them to deploy it. As I said, and then the other part, and Brian already addressed that, and that's always where the difficulties start, because as much as I find this important, I also find it very important not to make choices that I believe the market should do for themselves, especially when it comes to picking technologies and finding what works best. I strongly am convinced that the market is the one to make that choices, because they are the ones building and running the networks. I am not. I used to do that, but it's a long time ago. And that's often a tightrope. So what we dare do is and we do recognize there is a role there, and also within the European regulatory framework, and for instance the NIST directive, so the Network Information Security Acts that are in there. Those very much are focused on risk, and I think that's where, as a policymaker, and as I said, we are there to protect the public interest. And what we try to do with the industry, and especially with the larger or the more important companies, is have a discussion about risk. And routing security is part of that discussion. When our regulators go in and talk about critical infrastructure, they do want to have a chat about sort of looking at how much are you depending on routing and routing security, and what measures are you taking. And what we find is then when you have that dialogue and you talk to them, and you basically sometimes with regulatory in hand can actually say, like, we actually want an answer, not just want to think about it. I want you to write it down and explain what you're doing. You kind of see that market converge to what is commonly there. And then you see that a lot of people are deploying RPKI and say like, yes, see, I'm actually taking steps to mitigate that risk. At the meantime, and I think that's really important to highlight again, is what Brian said, we are agile, we are open to alternatives. I'm not mandating RPKI, we are not pushing people into a certain solution, but what we are pushing the companies and the internet providers to is think about it and have that chat, and please explain what you are doing to secure your routing. And then you often see that the measures that are listed in manners are often the ones that resurface as probably the best way forward to do it. So that's kind of the way we fly it there. Another important part, and we find that also within the government, we are enforcing it on ourselves, but it's still often a difficult dialogue to get it to priority we want. And the tooling Gerben already said, Internet.nl, the website, the measurement tool, offers a lot of transparency. And we also do that internally and try to kind of spark some competition between departments, competition between city councils, to actually show what they are doing compared to their peers. And that's also in the government a really important tool, as it turned out, to try and incentivize people to do these things and deploy these things, because nobody wants to be on the bottom of that list. And in that sense, the efforts that Gerben and together with the multi-stakeholders, the group behind the platform and the group behind Internet.nl are doing a really important job in providing that transparency and providing that incentive to be on top of the list. That's roughly the landscape that we're working in and the challenges we are facing.
Thanks for that, Marco and Gerben. And I especially find that interesting and really cool, the idea of having different departments and municipalities competing against each other to see who's best at routing security. It makes me think of, I live in a small town, and I know my neighbor works in our infrastructure, works in the public works department, and he talks about how they do, contingency planning for things like floods and for major storms and all those sorts of things, as the whole government here does. But I don't think they do anything on routing security. I would highly, highly doubt that in my town of 26,000 if they did that. So moving on now to Doug with the U.S. government, and your perspective on the challenges that we're seeing specifically in the U.S. when it comes to routing security.
Thanks, Ryan. Maybe picking up on a couple of the previous themes. One, I think a focus on end user, if that means individuals, consumer, broadband, is kind of the wrong focus, right? I think where we need to raise both awareness and inspire action is in the CISOs, the Chief Information Security Officers of enterprises of all sorts, government and commercial, to understand the importance of internet routing to their enterprise. And these are folks who typically, right, are focused on the resources inside their enterprise, inside their building, inside their fence of their campus. But in the modern cloud-first era and remote working, the reality is most enterprises' internal operations now depend on BGP working to either connect their employees back to their enterprise infrastructure, or, in the case, certainly in the US government, there's strong cloud first initiatives. All of our critical infrastructural services, from email, web, file storage, are actually out in the internet, right? We stop functioning internally if BGP routing stops functioning externally. And getting that, I think, as Marco alluded to, on the radar screens of chief information security officers to understand the importance of the problem space and the potential threat space, such that they can take action, not just in adopting, if it's RPKI and our ROV technologies themselves, but more critically, requiring it in their RFPs, right, for procurement of services, either as ISP, simple transit services, or our cloud-based providers of critical infrastructure, email, web, file storage. we need to be asking those external service providers to be protecting routes to those services, right? If you wanted to hijack NIST's web space, you're actually hijacking a route out of AWS, not NIST, right? And so we need our service providers to be taking action as well. And that is done, as others have alluded to, in sort of the incentive model, through the power of purchase, right? Including those requirements in RFPs for services. Another thing I'd like to point out, right, is that, BGP is one of the few true global protocols in the internet, meaning things that we put in BGP updates that leave NIST, and the data and the attributes go all around the world. And the point being is that evolving that kind of truly global end-to-end core infrastructure takes time, right? As I see, some frustration sometimes about the speed of deployment. When you try to evolve core global infrastructure, speed of deployment is measured in decades. And you might think that's a bad thing, but it's actually a good thing, right? Because introducing good in the following sense is that, introducing security technologies into a global distributed system like BGP introduces new complexities, right? And there's potential resilience questions focused on the new security technologies, right? You can think about things like, if new BGP security technologies interfere with BGP-based mechanisms for DDoS mitigation, right? And so you have to build trust and confidence in those new security technologies, and that takes time. And in the case of the routing security, I think what we've seen in the last 5 years is confidence building in the industry in the resource public key infrastructure, and the first security mechanisms based on RPKI, right? And that's confidence in the entire ecosystem, from like the RIR's operations of RPKI infrastructure, confidence in the software infrastructure for validating caches, the maturity of route validation features and commercial routers. All of that stuff has to mature to the point where we make sure that the new security technologies are they themselves not introducing robustness and resilience questions. And specifically in the U.S. and specifically in the U.S. government, there's, some particular challenges to overcome. Many of us are holders of, at least an IPv4 legacy address space. There are some issues that have made a lot of progress in the last couple years about working with ARIN to accommodate those who typically have not been holders of registration services agreements, to allow us to enroll our number resources in ARIN and avail ourselves of RPKI services. Those are topics that have seen significant advancement in the last 5 years as well. So I think we're well positioned to move forward in these areas, such as government deployment and deployment by legacy address holders, that we weren't, 3-5 years ago, right? And so I guess having worked on IP issues and DNS issues as well, I think routing security is moving at about the pace it should, right? Is that something as global and as important as BGP, you don't want to jump on the latest hot RFC to come out of the IETF, right? Commercial ISPs have to be sure that there's, resilient infrastructure behind it, and that those mechanisms themselves are capable of standing up to the complexities of the current internet.
Thanks for that, Doug. And I totally agree that we're starting to see more confidence in these technologies. And one thing I just put in the chat for folks to see is there was actually a study that recently came out from Job Snyders and Doug Midori, analyzing how much impact RPKI and route origin validation are actually having on reducing the propagation of invalid routes and routing incidents more broadly. And what was really interesting to me there was reading that we're already having a really big impact in terms of what our end goal is, which is more security and less routing incidents on the internet. And that's only going to grow with more deployment of these technologies. And so I think seeing things like that study and hearing from you all about how there is more confidence now in these technologies is honestly very reassuring, and definitely reassuring to some of my colleagues who have been working on routing security for over a decade now and trying to improve this space. So I'm really happy to hear that. So we've talked about the challenges and kind of the landscapes that we're working with. Now I'm interested to hear what your governments are specifically doing, or your strategies from your governments are on improving routing security, and really the ways that network operators globally or in your region or country can really get involved with you all. What are the opportunities for engagement? What should people who are listening to this call start to know about how to work with you all on improving routing security, and taking the 1 or 2/3 reduction in of propagation of bad routes up to 100% or closer to 100%. We'll never get to 100%, but closer. So first off, Veronica, what is Singapore's government doing on routing security, and how can this community help?
Well, I suppose one thing I wanted to say is that actually we generally take a fairly light touch on internet-related matters, but I think we're lucky in the sense that Singapore is a small city-state, and being small has its constraints, but it also has some advantages in terms of the number of key network operators that we have in the country. As an industry like this in telecoms and in ISPs, basically this tends to be an oligopoly, which means that there would typically be a few large players that would have a reasonably large size of the market. And once we work with the bigger players to take some action, then you can see that the impact can be quite significant within the country. So we said earlier on that where cybersecurity and where routing security is concerned is really a collective action. So it's not just about a top-down government push, but very much government playing a role to nudge operators along. And I guess coming from the perspective of the operators, they would also want to do the right things to be able to put in place all the best practices for routing security, things like making sure that the correct routing information for its customers are being announced, turning on filtering to mitigate spoofing and so on. And what is also heartening is that there are also the major equipment providers, the likes of your Cisco's, Junipers, and Huawei's, that tend to supply to the ISPs and network operators. They also have equipment programs that actually support manners as well. So I think collectively, from nudging from the government, basically the major operators participating in the initiatives, as well as for equipment manufacturers also then doing this and driving active participation, this would be probably a very logical way for countries to be able to move forward to contribute to a more secure routing system globally. So Singapore is a small country. I guess our internet population size and users is really, really small compared to the rest of the world. We probably can't influence that much in that way, but I guess we can do what we can here to do our part to, well, at least make our part of the world a bit more secure and work with the rest of the world. As the world moves along, we will also want to move along too.
Thanks for that, Veronica. Gerben and Marco, and I know we've caught a little bit of this from you, Marco, earlier about things that the Dutch government are doing, but if you could expand a little bit more on that. But first off, Gerben.
Yeah, and Marco already mentioned that we have a government initiative where standards are quite considered to be important, and some of the most relevant internet standards are those that we, as the Dutch Internet Standards Platform, also focus on. Not only in open debates and dialogue with many different parties, from network operators to sometimes even end users or small companies. To simplify that for them, we developed the website internet.nl. I provided a link to the English version in the chat, where we added last August the RPKI test as well. So we saw an uptake in those tests. And one of the good things is that if you score 100%, for example, as a hosting provider, you will be added to the Hall of Fame. So there is an incentive for them to show, even when new standards or stricter elements of a standard appear in our test suite, that they try to keep the 100% score that they had before. And of course, we do help them. If there are specific things in settings of their network or other details, then we have a lot of specialists working with us that can help those operators to fine-tune the settings of their own network. And offering insight in what kind of operators are already there with a high score enables whatever end user it might be. It could be a single civilian looking at what is good when I buy services from a specific provider, but it could also be a small or medium-sized enterprise that has no internal IT specialist and has to rely upon what an operator tells him that he is offering. Then he can still check at internet.nl, is this true? And we try to do our best in a public-private partnership, which our platform is. The guidance for that platform comes from especially what is called the forum standardization in the Netherlands, where Marco already explained that comply or explain is the basic rule for Dutch government. If a selected standard is on the list, then you simply have to either comply or explain why you don't follow that specific standard, also in purchasing. And that is very helpful to make sure that industry follows these standards. I think for the moment that is enough from our side, but we have seen uptake in the scoring on RPKI since last August quite well, and Dutch government is ahead of commercial organizations, but I hope they will follow.
So one follow-up question I have on that is, I really like this Hall of Fame idea, and I mean, we do that to a degree with manners as well. Are you manners compliant as a sort of gold star for network operators in the Netherlands? Have you seen that? I'm wondering how well does that work with the big network operators? Is this something that more helps with smaller network operators who are trying to differentiate themselves, or do the bigger network operators try to get on this Hall of Fame as well, even though they might already have big market share?
I completely agree. It is for the smaller operators much more attractive to show off and show their specific customers that they are indeed doing better than some of the large ones. But we have seen an uptake with the larger ones as well. And one big operator in the Netherlands is KPN, and they have adapted rapidly quite a few of the standards that are propagated at internet.nl. And we did have some very good talks with them, both from government and from our public-private initiative. So I think they saw that in the end, it is best for them to, because they want to serve the Dutch government as well. And there, these standards are requested. So why not offer it to their normal end users as well? So they have a high uptake. For example, IPv6, they have now an almost 100% compliancy, also on mobile phone networks. So they did a good job.
That's pretty amazing. Marco, more to add on that?
To steal it from a famous brand, just do it. But joking aside, I think Veronica said an important one is everybody has to do their little part. And as Gerben said, it's like, yes, we can incentivize via purchasing, but it's always the ask. And in terms of what can you do if you're listening here, if you are a network operator, why not just offer it? And too often I have those chats about IPv6, I have those chats with RPKI. Too often I get feedback back as like the customer isn't asking for it. But the customer never asked for IPv4 and the customer never asked for BGP. You just switch it on. Nobody told you to run BGP. You did it on your own incentive. But when it comes to routing security, I have even people that say, like, sorry, you have to really tell me to do it via legislation. And as I explained, there are consequences there, and we try to avoid using legislation to tell you how to run a network. But there is a counter to that, and that is do it on your own momentum, do it on your own incentive. And I do hope in that sense, also what Doug earlier said, it's like, yeah, it is about also protecting your customers, and it should be part of your natural habit to do the best job you can. And I do hope that we somehow, by having these kind of conversations, and I would call on anybody who has gone to implementation, don't treat it as a trade secret, please. Everybody has to do this. So share your experiences, try to help others, because in the end, the whole ecosystem has to be secure to really have the benefit. You're not helping yourself if you're only deploying RPKI in your own network. It's about the other networks also deploying it and helping each other. And I think that's also where, again, Gerben and the platform really comes in, and also at the global level, of course, these kind of seminars, but also the Internet Governance Forum, and then all kind of other multi-stakeholder initiatives that there are to actually help each other and learn from each other, and then work together to make this ecosystem more secure. And I do hope that in the long run, that relies less on sticks and carrots and having more people doing this on their own momentum. But we're probably still a long way.
So what I'm hearing, to completely misquote a president of the United States, is ask not what routing security can do for you, but ask what you can do for routing security. Is a bit of the pitch there, which I don't know if that'll work, but we can try it. Doug, we've heard a bit from Brian about kind of the bigger broad national cybersecurity strategy and the high level of what OCD is planning to do, and the administration's planning to do. Could you share more about kind of how the U.S. government has worked on this in the past, and then also things that NIST is doing, or more generally in the U.S. government as well, if you want to add more to what Brian was mentioning earlier?
Sure. It's important to note Brian's comments about the larger ONCD road mapping effort and the activities of the FCC. But looking more specifically at NIST, Brian mentioned two specific initiatives as part of the national strategy to accelerate the development of standardization and support the adoption and collaborating with key stakeholders. And I think NIST has a unique role and history in this space. We've been working continuously with the IETF, academic and operator communities to pursue those objectives since actually the first U.S. National Cyber Strategy Plan in 2003. And we see our role as contributing to that entire life cycle, helping the community understand the problem space, developing and standardizing solutions. We provide a lot of test and measurement tools focused at vendors, implementers to expedite commercialization. And then we produce these guidance documents to foster adoption. And we've done that over we follow that cycle, what we think of as sort of a life cycle of technology development over a range of BGP security and robustness technologies, or RPKI and origin validation, BGP sec path validation. And what we're currently working on is and focusing on is route leak mitigation. And so, an example of our contributions, if we look at what's going on with a spec called ASPA, Autonomous System Provider Authorization. We currently co-author the IETF ASPA validation spec, which we hope is going to progress towards the next step to becoming an RFC at next week's IETF meeting. We've developed and published ASPA reference implementations, test tools, and synthetic data sets, right? So, an interesting thing in the early stages of any of these, global BGP technologies is how do they work at scale? And so we've produced test harnesses and test tools that can feed ASPA data at internet scales to routers to allow them to do interoperability and scaling tests. We're in the process of extending our RPKI monitor to include ASPA RPKI data and look at ASPA validation of routes. And eventually, back to my theme about these technologies need time to mature and build confidence. As ASPA technologies mature, eventually we will update NIST guidance documents to talk about, as a practical matter, how you would adopt them. And so we see taking these problem spaces, if you will, from problem definition to fostering deployment is sort of our unique role, and one that we've done actually in this space for 20 some years now.
Thanks for that. And thanks for all the work that you and NIST are doing. And I did want to ask a little bit more about ASPA because folks who are watching might not know what it is. And if you could give a really quick, just a really quick explanation of what it is and why you're excited about it.
ASPA is another RPKI-based technology, if you will. And so that's an important thing to realize, that the RPKI has become a trust infrastructure upon which we're building different solutions, right? Origin validation is built there. Path validation is built there. And ASPA is something new, relatively new, to allow designed to solve the problem of route leaks, where routes accidentally typically get redistributed from client networks to provider networks in a way that causes major disruptions. But ASPA allows autonomous system enterprise or commercial transit networks to declare who their authorized transit providers are, right? And if you will, that begins to build a graph, if you will, a data set of the connectivity between autonomous systems. It's only declaring in the up direction who your transit providers are. Most route leaks are caused by erroneously redistributing routes that were only destined for your customers to a transit or peer provider, sort of violating the business rules, if not the forwarding rules of the internet. And ASPA validation, ASPA allows you to create new objects in the RPKI, new digitally signed objects that you can declare who your transit providers are. Routers can download that data, while relying parties can download that data, validate it, and feed it to routers. And so you get a bit of a verification of feasible paths in the internet. It doesn't quite have the same security properties as BGP-SEC. So you get a notion of the set of feasible paths that an update might take. And then more importantly, you get a clear and distinct validation of whether a route has leaked, something that was started down a chain from a transit provider to its customers that gets leaked back up the chain. And that's sort of called a route leak. There's an RFC that we co-authored with some folks from industry that sort of explains the space of route leaks. And so this is the first step towards some degree of, one, route leak mitigation that scales globally, and two, some form of path validation, right? Because RPKI and ROV is wonderful. You point to data that shows it's actually impacting our ability to stop the propagation of invalid routes. But if your threat space includes malicious actors, then you're going to begin to need to do various forms of path validation. And ASPA is one form of path validation with maybe the important property that it doesn't change BGP on the wire or require crypto on routers. BGP-SEC provides you full path validation, but it requires crypto to be done on the routers and the control plane.
That's really, really interesting. And I always find it very interesting when we're starting to put more intelligence into the network itself, and kind of the trade-offs that are being weighed on whether or not it's worthwhile. BGPsec, is it worthwhile to have the having to do so much more there, but is it more worthwhile on things like HASPA, for instance, in terms of the impact that you're going to have? And so I find that to be a really fascinating discussion.
It's interesting in the discussion of the range of solution technologies to understand which problems they solve and which problems they don't, but particular a few key aspects of their practicality, or at least how to evaluate them. Do they change BGP on the wire, or is it sort of this adjunct system where you can download data from outside BGP to use in your router to help evaluate routes, right? RPKI ROV has that property. We don't change BGP on the wire. We provide data that allows you to perform some forms of route filtering. ASPA is the same. We're not changing BGP on the wire. We're downloading data from an external system that allows you to filter. Things that change BGP on the wire, you can go back to my comment that it's one of the few global end-to-end protocols, is a bigger lift, whether or not it even requires crypto. If you begin to change BGP on the wire, it takes longer to build confidence about the deployment scenarios. Yeah, it's just a different form of complexity.
And looking at IPv6 deployment, we all know that making major changes to really big pieces of the internet that everyone uses goes perfectly swimmingly, and everything goes fine. So having listened to Marco's presentations on IP addressing over the years, I know that's not always the case. Checking now the chat, see if anyone has any questions or comments that they want to make. I'm not seeing many. I'm seeing lots of information from folks with links. Thank you again for that, especially Robert and Sriram. That's fantastic. Otherwise, I think we'll go ahead and jump to final thoughts on how we move forward on this, and really, what do you want to leave this audience with in terms of working with governments on routing security, and maybe your prognosis on the future of routing security? It's sounding slightly optimistic from what I'm hearing from folks, so I'm hoping that holds true. But we'll start off with you, Veronica.
So being the cybersecurity person in the room, I just wanted to make an observation that firstly, the pace of digitalization is accelerating, and especially with the global pandemic. The threat landscape is also becoming more hostile with more brazen threat actors. So what this really means is that BGP, without all the security in place, can be increasingly vulnerable, not just to threat actors, but also end user misconfiguration. So I guess what I wanted to end off with is really a call for action for us to do our part to generate awareness, so that there's a certain end user pressure that will actually create the right incentive structures for everyone involved in the ecosystem to actually move towards a secure routing system globally.
Thank you for that, Veronica. Marco and then Gerben. Switch it up.
Yeah, what Veronica said, and I think that's the most important part. We talked a lot about sort of a lot of people treating this as inertia, and often from security, and then Doc also addressed that. From a security and stability perspective, inertia is kind of good, because you don't want to run along with sort of the next big thing, and then you want to have confidence that it actually is doing what it needs to do, and introduces resilience, and then maintains your stability and continuity. At the same time, we also must be aware, as Veronica just mentioned, that the threat landscape is evolving very rapidly, and we should also keep evolving ourselves and keep rethinking the way we think about security. And then I think also ESPA is a nice way forward. So keep also looking for new opportunities, and don't just take what there is for granted. This is a rapidly evolving ecosystem. Even though we are looking to changes that take 20 years, it still is rapidly evolving, and take that into consideration and move along.
Thank you, Marco.
Yeah, I think a lot has been said that is really valuable. What I could perhaps add is that we always should try to find coalitions of countries, governments that are willing to work closely together in reaching the level of requiring things. As we mentioned before, if a small country like the Netherlands is asking vendors, suppliers, operators to do something, sometimes it helps. But if we work together, for example, at a European level, that makes it a lot easier. And although we do a lot of things together in Europe, sometimes it's still a long way to convince them that internet standards are relevant topics as well to discuss together. But working together, that would be my part of this discussion.
That's great. And that's a really good point about the power of purchasing power is only as strong as your power to purchase. So it's a very good point. Doug.
I guess I'd like to echo the last 2 points. Is I think we're making progress. I often, at least internally, point out that route leaks was the first thing I ever worked on at NIST 36 years ago. So we are making progress. We've found a trust infrastructure that seems to by now be providing a stable foundation to build other solutions. I think all the points about it's an iterative process, right? Is that some of these solutions, are at a different stage of their maturity. Governments or whatever incentive models you want can begin to think about pushing for their adoption. Others are not, and right. So we have to see how that kind of plays out in the commercial space and the realization of products and services before we know if they're truly suitable to move forward. So I think it's an iterative process. Progress has been made more in the last 5 years than in the previous 30 years of working on this topic. So there is reason to be optimistic, but there's also reason to be cautious and prudent as we roll these technologies out and begin asking through whatever means, the power of purchase or policies, asking our service providers to implement them.
Thanks, Doug. And I think that's a great way to end it. And I thank you all for all the work that you have done over the years on improving routing security and the work that you all are doing with your governments on improving routing security. I think it's a really exciting time in this space and a very cool moment where we're starting to see the hard work from all of you leading to impact. And so again, thank you for that. And thank you again for coming and speaking on this panel, wherever you are coming from in the world. And for folks who are following along on Zoom, there's a quick poll for people to take. But otherwise, I want to just thank you all again and thank you all of our audience for coming in and listening in. And if you want to find out more things about Manners, go to manners.org. And also check out those links that everyone put in the chat about with the resources on routing security from different governments. So thank you all again and have a good rest of your days or evenings.